Run their IDs. The white woman snapped across the candlelit lawn, her voice sharp enough to cut through the soft jazz drifting beneath the string lights. People like this fake luxury all the time. The music died almost instantly. Wine glasses froze halfway to lips. Conversations collapsed into silence beneath the warm Georgia night as two police cruisers rolled slowly to the curb outside the mansion gates, their red and blue lights splashing across the ivory wedding tent like bruised watercolor. Naomi Carter stood at the end of the flower-lined aisle in a satin gown that shimmered softly beneath the hanging lanterns, one hand wrapped around a bouquet of white roses, the other resting lightly against her stomach as if steadying something deeper than nerves. She didn't move, didn't speak, didn't even blink when the first officer stepped onto the lawn. Around her, more than 100 guests shifted uneasily in their seats. Some reached for phones. Others looked away, already embarrassed by what this had become. Across the property line, Evelyn Whitmore stood rigid beside her stone fence in a pale cashmere sweater despite the humid June heat, arms folded tightly across her chest as if she were guarding the entire neighborhood from contamination. Her diamond earrings glimmered beneath the patrol lights every time she shook her head in disgust. "I told dispatch this party was out of control," she continued loudly. "The noise, the traffic, the shouting. This neighborhood has standards." Officer Ryan Keller adjusted the radio clip to his shoulder and scanned the crowd carefully. The wedding wasn't loud. In fact, the only sound now was the soft crackle from a nearby heater lamp and the distant hum of cicadas drifting through the oak trees. He glanced toward the live jazz trio near the dance floor. Even they sat frozen, instruments lowered awkwardly in their laps. Daniel Brooks, the groom, stepped forward immediately, jaw tight beneath the clean line of his beard. "Officer, we have a permit for the event," he said calmly, though tension pulled hard beneath his voice. Everything was cleared with the city 2 months ago. Evelyn laughed under her breath. Not a warm laugh, the kind that carried poison under polished manners. "A permit doesn't erase common sense," she said. "And honestly, look around. Since when did this street start hosting nightclub weddings?" Several guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. Naomi finally lifted her eyes toward Evelyn. There was no anger in her expression. That somehow made the moment worse. The bride's calmness sat heavy over the lawn like pressure before a thunderstorm. A breeze drifted through the hanging linen curtains around the reception tent, lifting the edge of Naomi's veil just enough for the candlelight to brush across her face. Officer Keller noticed it then. She wasn't nervous. She wasn't intimidated. If anything, she looked tired, like this wasn't new to her. "Ma'am," Keller said carefully, stepping closer. "We received multiple complaints about excessive noise and possible unauthorized alcohol service." Naomi nodded once, slow and graceful. "I understand, officer." Her voice came out low and even, smoother than the jazz that had filled the evening only minutes earlier. No defensiveness, no fear. That seemed to unsettle Evelyn more than anything else. "See," Evelyn interrupted quickly. "That attitude right there. Like she owns the place." Naomi's fingers tightened gently around the bouquet stems. Tiny beads of moisture glimmered against the white ribbon wrapped around them. Somewhere near the back row, a champagne flute tipped over onto the tablecloth with a dull clink that sounded far louder than it should have. Keller glanced between the two women, the air around them tightening by the second. Then his radio crackled softly against his shoulder. Another unit had arrived. The second patrol car stopped beside the curb with a low crunch of gravel, its headlights sweeping briefly across the white marble fountain near the center of the estate before shutting off. The sudden darkness beyond the flashing police lights made the wedding candles glow even warmer, soft gold reflecting across crystal glasses and polished silver trays left untouched on the reception tables. Naomi Carter remained perfectly still at the front of the aisle, her satin gown falling around her like liquid ivory. Beneath the hanging lanterns, tiny diamonds along the neckline caught the light every time she breathed. Daniel stood beside her now, one hand lightly against the small of her back, protective without appearing possessive. The gesture looked natural, practiced, like the kind of quiet support built over years instead of weeks. Officer Keller noticed how the guests watched Naomi more than the police. That detail lingered in the back of his mind. Important people usually looked irritated when interrupted. Some became loud. Others tried to dominate the room immediately. Naomi didn't either. She simply waited. Calm. Composed. Almost impossibly composed. Behind the officers, Evelyn Whitmore continued speaking as though silence itself offended her. I have lived on this street for 23 years, she declared loudly enough for half the lawn to hear. We worked very hard to maintain the character of this neighborhood. Her eyes drifted slowly across the guests seated beneath the reception tent. Expensive tailored suits. Elegant evening gowns. Diamond bracelets catching candlelight. Yet something in her expression suggested she still refused to believe they belonged there. Naomi lowered her bouquet carefully onto a nearby chair before smoothing one hand over the fabric at her waist. Her movements were graceful, controlled, every gesture carrying the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to rooms watching her closely. A younger officer stepped onto the lawn and leaned toward Keller. Dispatch confirmed the permit, he murmured under his breath. Everything checks out. Keller nodded slowly, but Evelyn overheard anyway. Permits are not the issue, she interrupted sharply. This entire event has been disruptive since the afternoon. Luxury cars blocking driveways. Loud music. Crowds everywhere. One elderly guest near the front finally spoke, his deep voice carrying through the tense silence. Ma'am, the quartet stopped playing nearly 10 minutes ago. Evelyn ignored him completely. Her attention stayed locked on Naomi with almost personal resentment now. Daniel exhaled slowly through his nose. Naomi touched his wrist gently before he could respond. Again, that same calmness. It unsettled Keller more the longer he stood there. A server carrying a tray of untouched champagne flutes moved quietly through the edge of the crowd, uncertain whether to continue working or disappear completely. Somewhere behind the tent, wind rustled through the magnolia trees lining the property, carrying the scent of fresh roses and rain-soaked grass through the warm summer air. The wedding itself looked breathtaking. White orchids draped from the tent poles. Candlelight flickered across polished hardwood dance flooring built over the lawn. Every detail had been designed carefully, tastefully. Nothing about the evening resembled the chaos Evelyn kept describing. Keller glanced back toward Naomi again. Up close, she looked even younger than he first thought, maybe late 30s, her skin glowing softly beneath the suspended lights overhead. But her eyes carried something older. Experience. Discipline. The kind built from surviving rooms where people underestimated you before you even spoke. Evelyn folded her arms tighter. Honestly, officer, somebody needed to step in before this got completely out of hand. Naomi finally lifted her gaze toward her neighbor fully. The air shifted almost immediately. No anger crossed her face. No visible hurt either. Just a long, measured silence that somehow made Evelyn sound smaller after every passing second. Then Naomi spoke quietly. Mrs. Whitmore, she said, her voice smooth as velvet beneath the humid Georgia night. You have called the police on this address 3 times in the last 6 months. Several guests exchanged surprised glances. Evelyn's expression hardened instantly. Because people should respect where they live. Naomi tilted her head slightly. Even when no laws are being broken? The question landed softly. Too softly. That made it heavier. Keller felt the younger officer beside him shift uncomfortably. Somewhere near the back tables, a man in a navy suit lowered his champagne glass and studied Naomi carefully, concern flickering across his face. Another guest leaned toward him and whispered something Keller could not hear. But one phrase reached him clearly as the breeze carried it across the lawn. Your Honor. Keller's eyes moved back toward Naomi immediately. The single phrase drifted through the humid night air so quietly that most guests probably missed it, but Officer Ryan Keller heard it clearly enough to feel something tighten beneath his uniform collar. Your Honor. He turned his head slowly toward the man who had spoken, an older black gentleman in an impeccably tailored charcoal suit, with silver hair and a folded white pocket square. The man immediately lowered his eyes and adjusted his cuff as if he regretted saying it out loud. Keller looked back at Naomi Carter. She gave no reaction at all. That silence felt deliberate now. Around the reception lawn, candle flames flickered gently beneath the hanging lanterns while soft wind rolled through the white linen drapes surrounding the dance floor. The entire wedding looked less like a loud party and more like something from a magazine spread. Elegant, controlled, refined. Nothing about it matched the picture Evelyn Whitmore kept trying to paint. Yet Evelyn seemed more irritated with every passing second that the officers had not already shut the event down. "I know exactly how these situations go," she said sharply, stepping closer to the edge of the property line. "People move into neighborhoods like this, and suddenly the whole area changes overnight." Several guests exchanged uncomfortable looks. One woman quietly lowered her champagne flute onto the tablecloth without taking a sip. Daniel Brooks inhaled slowly beside Naomi, his broad shoulders stiff beneath the midnight blue tuxedo tailored perfectly against his frame. The gold cuff links at his wrists caught the flashing patrol lights every time he flexed his hands. He looked seconds away from responding. Naomi touched his arm again, light as falling snow. "Calm down." The gesture said everything without words. Officer Keller studied her face carefully now. Her makeup remained flawless despite the heat, soft bronze tones catching candlelight along her cheekbones. But her eyes had changed slightly since the conversation began. Not fear, not anger, fatigue. The kind worn by someone who had spent years mastering the art of remaining graceful. While being quietly insulted in public, Keller suddenly became aware that nearly everyone at the wedding seemed highly educated. Older couples spoke with polished restraint. Younger guests wore expensive watches and government-style lapel pins. Near the back of the lawn, two women in formal dresses whispered beside a long marble fire table, both glancing repeatedly toward Naomi with visible concern. This was not random wealth. It felt institutional somehow. Political, judicial, important. "Officer," Evelyn continued, her voice climbing sharper now that nobody was agreeing with her fast enough. "I should not have to explain why this kind of gathering makes people uncomfortable at 10 o'clock at night." Naomi finally looked directly at her neighbor again. The air seemed to still beneath the magnolia trees. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said softly, "our wedding ceremony began at 6:30. Her voice remained astonishingly gentle. "The music has stayed below the county sound ordinance all evening." Keller glanced toward the younger officer again. The younger man nodded almost invisibly. Dispatch had already confirmed that. Evelyn crossed her arms tighter. "Well, maybe the county standards are dropping too." Silence. Heavy silence. Somewhere beyond the estate walls, thunder rumbled faintly in the distance, low and rolling across the Georgia sky. Naomi lowered her eyes briefly toward the bouquet resting beside her. White roses. Ivory ribbon. Tiny droplets of water still clinging to the petals from the afternoon misting system set around the garden. When she looked back up, her expression remained composed enough to make Keller strangely uneasy. Most people under pressure either fought or folded. Naomi did neither. She simply stood there with the stillness of someone completely certain of herself. Then an older white man near the front row slowly rose from his chair. Tall, distinguished, navy suit pressed so sharply it looked untouched by the humidity. Keller recognized him instantly from local television interviews. Senator Arthur Bennett. The realization hit hard enough to send a pulse through his chest. The senator adjusted his glasses calmly and looked toward Naomi with unmistakable respect before turning toward Keller. "Officer," he said evenly, "perhaps this misunderstanding has gone far enough." Evelyn's face lost color for the first time all night. The moment Senator Arthur Bennett spoke, the atmosphere across the wedding lawn shifted so suddenly that even the cicadas beyond the hedges seemed to fall quiet. Officer Ryan Keller straightened instinctively, his hand lowering from the radio clipped near his shoulder. The senator stepped fully into the candlelight now, revealing the deep navy suit tailored perfectly against his tall frame and the polished American flag pin resting near his lapel. His silver hair gleamed beneath the hanging lanterns as he looked calmly between the officers and Naomi Carter. "This family has followed every city regulation," he said evenly. "Every permit was approved weeks ago." Evelyn Whitmore blinked rapidly, visibly thrown by his presence. "Senator Bennett, with respect, this is not about paperwork," she said quickly, forcing a brittle smile that did not reach her eyes. "It is about preserving the character of the neighborhood." Naomi lowered her gaze briefly, almost like she had heard those exact words too many times before. The satin fabric of her gown shimmered softly as warm wind moved through the open tent behind her. Somewhere deeper inside the reception area, a candle extinguished itself with a faint curl of smoke. Daniel Brooks shifted beside her, his expression tightening as he watched Evelyn continue speaking. People move in. Evelyn continued carefully. And suddenly there are crowds, noise, strangers everywhere. We worked hard for peace here. Keller noticed several guests exchange glances again. Nobody interrupted her. That somehow made her comments sound even harsher hanging in the humid night air. Naomi finally looked toward Officer Keller directly. "Officer," she said gently, "would you like to see the event permit personally?" Her voice carried no sarcasm, no challenge, just quiet professionalism. Keller nodded once. "Yes, ma'am." Naomi turned slightly toward a nearby reception table where a small ivory clutch rested beside folded dinner menus embossed in gold lettering. She walked slowly across the lawn, elegant even under pressure, the long train of her dress sliding softly over the white aisle runner behind her. Keller watched several guests subtly relax as she moved. It was strange. The entire wedding seemed emotionally connected to her composure. If she remained calm, everyone else followed. Naomi opened the clutch carefully and removed a slim leather document holder. Her fingers were steady, perfectly steady. She handed the papers toward Keller without hesitation. As he reviewed the permit, another detail caught his attention. The invitation card tucked partially inside the folder. Thick cream paper, gold embossed lettering. Expensive, formal, official looking. His eyes moved across the elegant script almost by accident. Honoring the marriage of federal judge Naomi Carter and Daniel Brooks. Keller's breath stalled for half a second. He looked up immediately. Naomi met his eyes calmly beneath the hanging lanterns. No triumph. No smug satisfaction. If anything, she almost looked disappointed that the evening had reached this point at all. The younger officer beside Keller leaned slightly toward the document. His entire posture changed the second he saw the title. Evelyn noticed the silence instantly. "What is it?" she asked sharply. Neither officer answered right away. Keller's pulse thudded once against his throat as realization settled fully into place. He knew the name now. Naomi Carter, recently appointed to the federal district court. He had seen her photograph months earlier during a televised ceremony at the courthouse downtown. The same calm eyes, the same measured expression. Behind him, several guests lowered their eyes discreetly, almost embarrassed on Evelyn's behalf. The senator adjusted his cufflinks slowly and stepped back without another word. He no longer needed to intervene. Evelyn's face tightened. "Wait," she said quietly, confusion creeping into her voice now. "Judge." Naomi reached out gently and closed the folder in Keller's hands before answering. "Tonight," she said softly, "I was hoping to simply be a bride." The sentence landed harder than any accusation could have. Keller suddenly became painfully aware of the flashing patrol lights washing across her wedding gown while guests stood frozen around them, holding untouched champagne beneath the Georgia summer sky. For the first time since arriving, he felt ashamed to still be standing there. The flashing patrol lights suddenly felt too bright against the wedding lawn, too harsh against the ivory silk of Naomi Carter's gown and the soft gold candlelight surrounding the reception tables. Officer Ryan Keller swallowed hard as he handed the leather folder back to her carefully, almost respectfully now. The younger officer beside him straightened immediately, shifting his weight with visible discomfort. Across the property line, Evelyn Whitmore stared at Naomi as though the woman standing before her had somehow changed shape in the last 30 seconds. "Federal judge?" Evelyn repeated faintly. "No, there has to be some mistake." Naomi accepted the folder with calm hands and slid it back into her clutch. Her diamond earrings shimmered softly when she lifted her chin toward the officers again. "There is no mistake, Mrs. Whitmore," she said quietly. Not cruel, not triumphant, just honest. That somehow made the silence afterward unbearable. Daniel watched her with unmistakable admiration beside the altar flowers, his eyes softer now, pride replacing tension. A warm breeze rolled through the magnolia trees lining the estate, stirring the hanging lanterns overhead until tiny patterns of light danced across the polished dance floor behind them. The wedding had been beautiful only minutes earlier. Now it felt suspended in something heavier. Embarrassment, realization, shame. Keller removed his hat slowly. "Your Honor," he began carefully, "I sincerely apologize for disrupting your ceremony tonight." Naomi looked at him for a moment before answering. "Officer, you responded to a call. That is your job." Her voice remained gentle, but there was exhaustion beneath it now, thin, and almost invisible beneath her composure. What matters is why the call was made in the first place. Evelyn inhaled sharply. Now hold on, she interrupted quickly. I did not know who she was. The sentence hung in the air for half a second before. Even Evelyn seemed to realize what she had actually said. Several guests looked down immediately. One woman near the front closed her eyes briefly as though the second-hand embarrassment physically hurt. Senator Bennett folded his hands calmly in front of him, saying nothing. He did not need to. Naomi turned toward Evelyn slowly. The train of her gown glided over the white aisle runner like water beneath the lantern glow. That is exactly the problem, she said softly. No raised voice. No anger. Yet the words landed harder than shouting ever could. Evelyn opened her mouth again, but nothing came out immediately. For the first time all evening, she looked uncertain. Human. Smaller somehow beneath the flashing lights and the towering oak trees around them. Keller suddenly noticed how tightly she gripped her own elbows, as if trying to hold herself together. Mrs. Whitmore, Naomi continued gently. You never asked who we were. You saw black guests arriving in expensive cars and assumed something illegal had to be happening. Nobody moved. Even the jazz musicians sat completely still near the stage, instruments resting forgotten in their laps. Somewhere behind the catering tables, ice shifted softly inside a silver champagne bucket with a faint crackling sound. Evelyn's face flushed deep crimson beneath the porch lights from her neighboring estate. I was protecting the neighborhood, she insisted weakly. Daniel exhaled quietly beside Naomi, but again Naomi touched his wrist before he could speak. Keller noticed that now too. Every time tension rose, she chose calm over escalation, dignity over humiliation. It changed the entire atmosphere around her. Naomi looked toward the officers once more. My father cleaned office buildings for 30 years, she said softly. My mother taught second grade until her eyesight failed. They saved for decades so I could attend law school. Her eyes drifted briefly toward the glowing reception tent behind her. Tonight was supposed to be about family. The younger officer lowered his gaze toward the grass. Keller felt heat rising beneath his collar despite the cooling night air. Evelyn stared at Naomi silently now, the confidence gone from her face completely. In the distance, thunder rolled again across the Georgia sky, deeper this time, while candlelight flickered gently against the white roses lining the aisle. Naomi finally reached for Daniel's hand and held it lightly in her own. Status should not be the thing that earns someone basic respect, she said. The entire lawn fell perfectly still. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. The only sound came from the soft rustling of magnolia leaves above the reception lawn and the distant roll of thunder stretching low across the Georgia night sky. Officer Ryan Keller stood motionless near the edge of the aisle, his hat still resting against his chest as embarrassment settled heavily into his posture. The flashing patrol lights continued washing faint blue and red reflections across the white wedding tent, but somehow the lights no longer felt aggressive. They felt misplaced, like something cold interrupting a moment that had once been warm. Naomi Carter remained standing beside Daniel beneath the hanging lanterns, her fingers lightly woven through his hand now. Candlelight softened the delicate lines of her face, brushing gold across the satin folds of her gown and catching tiny reflections inside the diamonds resting at her ears and wrists. She looked beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with wealth. Composed, grounded, untouchably dignified. Daniel looked down at her with quiet admiration, his thumb gently brushing against the back of her hand, as if reminding himself she was still there beside him after everything the evening had become. Around them, the guests slowly began breathing again. Some shifted in their seats. Others lowered their eyes toward untouched plates of wedding cake and cooling dinners beneath the candlelit tables. Nobody seemed eager to speak first. The silence itself carried too much weight now. Evelyn Whitmore stood alone near the stone fence separating the neighboring properties, her arms no longer folded tightly across her chest. They hung awkwardly at her sides instead. The confidence she wore earlier had disappeared completely beneath the warm porch lights behind her. For the first time all evening she looked older, smaller, human in a way pride rarely allows. Naomi glanced toward the officers once more. You should not have to know my title before deciding whether I deserve peace in my own home, she said quietly. Her voice remained soft enough that people leaned forward slightly just to hear her. There are people without power who experience this every single day. Keller lowered his eyes briefly toward the grass beneath his boots. The younger officer beside him swallowed hard and shifted uncomfortably again. Somewhere near the back tables, one of the violinists slowly adjusted her instrument against her shoulder, uncertain whether the wedding might finally continue. The motion felt almost sacred against the silence. Naomi looked toward the guests now instead of the officers. "My mother used to tell me something when I was little," she continued gently. "She said dignity is the one thing nobody can hand you and nobody can take away." Her eyes drifted briefly toward the glowing reception tent, toward the family members seated beneath the lanterns, toward the life she had built far beyond the assumptions people placed on her skin before hearing her story. "I spent years believing that if I worked hard enough, spoke carefully enough, achieved enough, moments like this would stop happening." The breeze lifted the edge of her veil softly behind her, carrying the faint scent of roses and rain through the warm air. "But prejudice does not always announce itself loudly," she said. "Sometimes it arrives politely. Sometimes it hides behind words like standards and neighborhood character." Evelyn closed her eyes briefly. Just briefly, but everyone saw it. Daniel tightened his hold on Naomi's hand with visible tenderness. No anger remained in his face now, only heartbreak for what this night had forced her to relive. Senator Bennett slowly lowered himself back into his chair near the front row, his expression solemn beneath the lantern glow. The guests remained silent beside him, many staring at Naomi with the kind of respect that comes only after witnessing grace under pressure. Keller inhaled slowly before speaking again. "Your Honor," he said quietly, "I am truly sorry." Naomi looked at him for a moment, then offered the faintest nod. Not because the situation was fixed, not because the damage disappeared, but because dignity sometimes means choosing peace even when you were never given any. The silence lingered for several more seconds after Naomi Carter's final words faded into the warm night air. Nobody rushed to fill it. The wedding lawn seemed suspended in stillness beneath the hanging lanterns and dark Georgia sky, every guest quietly absorbing the weight of what had just unfolded. Officer Ryan Keller slowly placed his hat back onto his head, though his movements lacked the rigid confidence he arrived with earlier. His posture had softened now beneath the flashing patrol lights that still painted faint colors across the white, tent walls and polished marble fountain near the center of the estate. Naomi remained beside Daniel at the altar, her hand resting gently in his while candlelight flickered across the satin fabric of her gown. The long veil trailing behind her shifted softly in the evening breeze, catching against the white rose petals scattered along the aisle runner. She looked composed, but closer now there was sadness resting quietly behind her eyes. Not dramatic sadness, the tired kind. The kind carried by someone who had spent years learning how to remain graceful through moments that should never have happened in the first place. Evelyn Whitmore stared at the ground for so long that several guests began looking away to spare her further humiliation. Her shoulders had lowered completely, the sharp edge in her voice gone. For the first time all evening, she seemed to understand what everyone else had understood minutes ago. This was never about noise. It was never about parking or permits or neighborhood standards. It was about assumptions she made the moment she saw black guests arriving at an elegant estate she unconsciously believed belonged to someone else. The realization settled visibly across her face. Heavy, inescapable. One of the older women seated near the front dabbed gently beneath her eyes with a folded napkin. Another guest reached quietly for her husband's hand beneath the tablecloth. Somewhere near the back of the reception tent, the violinist finally lifted her bow again and tested a single soft note that floated briefly through the night air before fading. Nobody stopped her this time. Senator Bennett leaned back slowly in his chair, watching Naomi with unmistakable respect. "You know," he said calmly into the silence, "Judge Carter once worked 3 jobs while attending law school." Several guests smiled faintly at the memory. Naomi lowered her eyes modestly. The senator continued. "She graduated top of her class anyway." Daniel looked toward her with quiet pride warming his face beneath the lantern glow. "And she still visits the same public school where her mother taught 2nd grade every Christmas," he added softly. Naomi exhaled through a small, embarrassed smile, almost wishing they would stop praising her publicly now that the attention had become overwhelming. But the stories kept coming gently from the guests around them. A federal prosecutor described Naomi mentoring young law students for free every summer. An elderly pastor spoke about her helping families facing eviction long before she ever became a judge. Piece by piece, the crowd painted a picture Evelyn had never bothered to imagine while standing behind her stone fence making assumptions about strangers. Keller listened quietly, each detail pressing heavier against his conscience. Naomi was powerful, yes, accomplished beyond question. But the stories people told about her were never about status. They were about kindness, character, service. Evelyn finally lifted her eyes toward Naomi again, and this time there was no defensiveness left in them. Only shame. I judged you before I even met you, she admitted quietly. The sentence barely rose above a whisper, but the stillness carried every word clearly across the lawn. Naomi looked at her for a long moment before answering. Most people do, she said gently. No bitterness touched her voice. Somehow that made the truth even harder to hear. A faint drizzle began drifting through the warm summer air then, tiny silver drops catching lantern light as guests slowly looked upward toward the darkening sky. Daniel smiled softly and brushed moisture from Naomi's shoulder with careful fingers. The jazz musicians exchanged glances before easing back into a slow melody, delicate piano notes floating across the estate once more. Life moving forward again. But nothing on that lawn felt quite the same anymore. The light rain continued falling gently across the estate, soft enough that nobody rushed for cover. Tiny droplets shimmered against the hanging lanterns and settled delicately onto the white rose petals lining the aisle, turning the entire wedding lawn into something dreamlike beneath the dark Georgia sky. The jazz trio resumed their melody quietly near the dance floor, warm piano notes drifting through the humid air while guests slowly relaxed back into their seats. But the atmosphere had changed forever. Conversations were softer now, more thoughtful. Naomi Carter stood beneath the floral arch with Daniel beside her, her satin gown glowing faintly beneath the rain-speckled lights overhead. A few damp curls had loosened near her temples, softening the strength in her face without diminishing it. If anything, she looked even more beautiful now that the carefully controlled evening had cracked open to reveal something painfully human underneath. Officer Ryan Keller stepped back toward the patrol cars with the younger officer beside him, both moving quietly as though afraid to disturb the fragile peace returning to the ceremony. Before reaching the curb, Keller turned once more toward Naomi. "Congratulations on your marriage, Your Honor," he said sincerely. Naomi gave him a small nod and a faint smile. "Thank you, officer." No resentment lingered in her voice. That kindness seemed to affect him more deeply than anger would have. He touched the brim of his hat respectfully before returning to the cruiser. Moments later, the flashing lights disappeared entirely, leaving only candlelight and rain beneath the magnolia trees. The absence of those lights changed everything. Warmth returned to the lawn immediately. Evelyn Whitmore remained standing near the stone fence long after the officers left, unsure whether to walk away or stay. Her pale sweater clung slightly at the shoulders from the drizzle, and mascara had begun fading faintly beneath her eyes, though she did not seem to notice. For the first time that evening, she looked directly at the wedding itself instead of the people attending it. The glowing lanterns, the carefully arranged orchids, the elderly relatives laughing softly beneath blankets offered by servers, the young flower girl asleep in her mother's lap beside the dance floor. It looked beautiful, peaceful, loving, nothing like the threat she imagined earlier. Naomi noticed Evelyn standing alone and gently released Daniel's hand. "Excuse me for a moment," she whispered softly. Daniel studied her face carefully before nodding once. Naomi crossed the lawn slowly through the falling drizzle, the long train of her gown sliding over damp grass behind her. Guests watched quietly as she approached the neighboring fence. Evelyn looked stunned when Naomi stopped a few feet away. "Mrs. Whitmore," Naomi said gently. Evelyn immediately lowered her eyes. "I owe you an apology," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly now. "Not because you are a judge, because I never treated you like a neighbor to begin with." Naomi stood silently for a moment while rain tapped softly against the stone pathway between them. Somewhere behind the reception tent, thunder rolled faintly again, distant now. "Fear has a way of disguising itself as superiority," Naomi said quietly. Evelyn looked up slowly. Naomi continued, her voice calm as ever. But underneath it, people are usually just afraid of what they do not understand. Tears gathered briefly in Evelyn's eyes before she looked away again, ashamed. I embarrassed myself tonight, she admitted. Naomi's expression softened. No, she said gently. Tonight gave you a chance to see something differently. The sentence settled over Evelyn like warmth after cold rain. No punishment. No cruelty. Just grace. Behind Naomi, the violinist began playing softly again while candlelight flickered across the reception lawn. Daniel watched her from beneath the floral arch, pride and love written openly across his face now. Evelyn inhaled shakily before offering the faintest smile. Your wedding is beautiful, she said. Quietly. Naomi looked back toward the glowing tent, toward the people she loved gathered beneath the lanterns and drifting rain. Then she smiled too. Small. Genuine. Peaceful. Thank you, she whispered. The rain stopped almost as quietly as it had begun. Tiny droplets still clung to the magnolia leaves and white orchids surrounding the reception lawn, reflecting the golden lantern light like scattered glass beneath the midnight sky. The air felt cooler now, softer somehow, carrying the scent of wet grass, roses, and candle smoke drifting lazily through the estate. Naomi Carter stood once more beneath the floral arch beside Daniel Brooks, her hand resting gently in his while guests slowly rose from their seats again. The tension that had gripped the evening for nearly an hour finally loosened its hold, replaced by something quieter and far more meaningful. Understanding. The violinist eased into a warm melody while servers relit a few candles extinguished by the drizzle. Soft laughter returned carefully at first, almost fragile, before spreading naturally across the reception lawn again. Naomi looked around at the people gathered beneath the lanterns. Her elderly aunt smiling through damp eyes near the front row. Daniel's younger cousins dancing barefoot near the edge of the marble fountain. Senator Bennett speaking quietly with Naomi's mother beneath a cream-colored umbrella while rainwater glimmered across the stone pathway around them. The wedding felt alive again, but changed forever. Daniel lifted Naomi's hand slowly and brushed his lips gently across her knuckles. You okay? He asked softly. Naomi looked at him for a moment, then nodded. I am now. Candlelight flickered across his face as he smiled back at her, warmth replacing the anger he carried earlier in the evening. Around them, the musicians transitioned smoothly into a slow jazz standard while guests drifted toward the dance floor beneath the hanging lights. Somewhere near the back tables, a little girl spun in circles through the damp grass until her mother laughed and pulled her into a hug. Life kept moving. That felt important somehow. Near the property line, Evelyn Whitmore remained standing, quietly beneath her porch light, no longer hiding behind the fence that separated the neighboring homes. For the first time since Naomi moved into the neighborhood nearly 8 months earlier, Evelyn seemed to truly see the people gathered next door instead of the assumption she attached to them. She watched Naomi laugh softly at something Daniel whispered and lowered her eyes briefly, ashamed of how quickly she had reduced an entire family to suspicion before learning a single thing about them. Officer Ryan Keller's patrol car was long gone now, but the memory of those flashing lights still lingered faintly in Naomi's mind. Not because she feared them, because she understood how differently the night could have ended if she had not carried status powerful enough to interrupt people's assumptions. She thought about the women she had represented years earlier before becoming a judge. The mothers overlooked in courtrooms. The fathers followed through stores. The young black students questioned in neighborhoods where they simply existed too confidently. Moments like tonight happened quietly across the country every day, often without witnesses, apologies, or understanding afterward. Naomi inhaled slowly, feeling Daniel's fingers tighten gently around hers. Then she looked back toward the glowing reception tent and chose not to let bitterness steal another second from the evening they built together. Ladies and gentlemen, the wedding coordinator announced warmly near the dance floor, may we finally invite the bride and groom to their first dance? Soft applause spread across the lawn immediately. Genuine this time. Naomi smiled fully for the first time all night. The kind of smile that reached her eyes and softened every trace of exhaustion in her face. Daniel guided her gently onto the polished dance floor while lanterns glowed overhead like suspended stars. Guests gathered close around them as the music swelled softly through the warm night air. Naomi rested one hand against Daniel's shoulder while he held her carefully at the waist, both of them swaying slowly beneath the lights as candle flames reflected across the damp marble fountain nearby. Beyond the estate gates, the neighborhood sat quiet again beneath the dark Georgia sky. No sirens, no shouting, no flashing lights. Only music drifting gently through the trees and the soft sound of two people continuing forward despite everything meant to interrupt their peace. And near the edge of the lawn, the small gold plaque beside the garden entrance shimmered beneath the lantern glow. Judge Naomi Carter,